the panel starts with Chairman Tim, and yes, I'm skipping his last name because I have no idea how to say it. And everyone tells me, everyone says, just call him Chairman Tim. That's what everyone does. So Chairman Tim of the Hopi tribe. I hope you're not offended by that. You'd be more offended if I tried to say your name. He's currently in his second four-year term as chairman. So I'm sure he had his fingerprints on the recent settlement that we've heard about. The plan in this panel is for Chairman Tim to primarily talk about the long history of settlement in the region, in the Colorado Plateau, and about the struggles of the ancestral Puebloans, sometimes known as the Anasazi, to achieve sustainability. And so that is followed in a very different sort of presentation by Jonathan Overpeck, or Peck as he's known, who is a climate scientist, a forward-looking climate scientist. So he will talk to us about this challenge of sustainability in the region going forward. This reminds me that if you don't know these people, I do encourage you to read their bios in the program. For Peck, for example, you'll see about his work with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which won the Nobel Peace Prize, and you'll see that he was recently elected to the National Academy of Sciences and all that sort of stuff. You know, serious people up here. Finally, we'll conclude with Daryl, who has wormed his way onto every panel in this guy. And we all love you, Daryl. We all do, but my God, Daryl. But Daryl's going to talk to us about a vision of a road forward, a document that was produced that I think he's actually going to hand it out even. So he'll do that. And together, all these things, hopefully they weave together beautifully, but I guess we'll see. So, okay, we'll start with Chairman Tim. Do you have a PowerPoint?
No, I don't.
Okay, you could talk from there or come up here, whatever makes you happy.
I'm joined by some amazing folks here, so I think I'll stick down here with everybody else. Good morning, everybody. What a beautiful morning, right? My name's Timothy Nuvangyaoma, and I have the honor of serving as the chairman of the Hopi tribe. I'm from one of the three villages that make up Second Mesa, the village of Masangnavi, Tobacco Clan. And if you're not familiar where Hopi is, well, we got to fix that. You got to come out and visit us. We're in northeastern Arizona, high up on the mesas, and we welcome anybody who wants to come learn more about Hopi and our culture, and some of the water issues that we're dealing with out there. To give you a little bit more context. So glad to be here. I want to just thank everybody yesterday. I thought yesterday was an amazing kickoff to this whole conference, and learning and educating, and the transparency that went along with a lot of the conversations that were happening here, backroom conversations that ensued out of the panels that came through. So just want to thank everybody for their participation and involvement in yesterday's conference, day one. When it comes to Hopi, I know there's some specific questions, and I want to touch on some of those key points. And we're talking about sustainability on this panel. So just to historically, Hopi has always worked, much like our tribal nations, First Nations, have always been in that space of sustainability and how we are preserving our natural resources. And I listened to what Vice Chairman Cloud mentioned yesterday, is nature provides for us, it gives to us, and how do we return that through protecting the environment ourselves. We all have a role in this, and we've been out in the area that we're at, in a much larger area, since time immemorial, and we've been dry farmers our whole life, and been able to sustain and use the resources that we have in order to provide for our people. I think you all are aware of our settlement. I know President Nygren spoke about that yesterday, and it's amazing. And Peck here mentioned to me, he's all, yeah, that's great news. And I says, it is. And he says, yeah, you're still smiling. I am still smiling about it. And I told him, I says, I'm still pinching myself too, because 40 years in an LCR adjudication is a long time to be looking at how we're going to move forward on this. So thankfully, we were all able to get together and learn and build on the foundation that was built from our elders. Hopi prophecy takes us way back at a time where this has already been a story that's been told well into the future. It's hard for me to fathom how they know this, but now that I'm here in this space, I look back and or just kind of bewilderment going, wow, they knew all this was coming. And to come to a place that we're at now in the space of really looking at this finite resource with water and what everybody's engaged in to look at this. I know the Creator put a lot of our natural resources here, not thinking that we'd come to a place that we'd be all trying to get a little piece of what is out there. This should have been here for all of us to sustain into the future, but we find ourselves here now. And so for us, part of that sustainability is knowing that we're going to be able to have some reliability, some reliable water resources to bring out to the Hopi tribe, to continue who we are as Hopis and maintain our livelihood, our culture, our traditions back on Hopi. So that lives on forever as well. And I'm just elated to know that we now have that reality that's in our path and to be able to do that. I think some of the lessons learned here for us are what industry brought out to Hopi quite some time back. We all know about Mojave Generating Station. We know about the Navajo Generating Station. We know what uranium mining does to our sacred homelands, but not only that, to Mother Earth in general. There's a lot of pollution that comes along with that. It gets into the water table, and it does impact that. So when we're looking at that, we have to think about future water quality, how that's going to impact the quantity of the water if it's, got pollutants in it that basically poisons a resource that we all need to live. I mean, it's cliche, but we all talk about water is life. It's true, though. So a lot of that are lessons learned from the past and how we have to be more protective and more conscious about what we know as our Hopi NEPA process, your environmental impact studies and everything associated with that. So when you're looking long-term down the road, we know we're not going to repeat some of the missteps we've taken. I'll even call them mistakes that we made in the past, lessons learned. And so at least historically, when we're looking at this moving forward, that's the place I'm coming from. We have to learn from this and find better feasible ways to protect these resources. There's just so much going on. I talk about pollution, and I was chatting with Vice Chairwoman Cloud this morning and about what I heard yesterday from, we have long last names, and I know you were afraid to say my last name because we butcher it, but I'm gonna take a chance at saying Adele's name also, Haig Khalil, and I'm sorry if I butchered that, but I understand. With the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, was sitting here talking, and he talked about taking a walk with his daughter and how he saw a sprinkler just going off, and he was like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna go say something, and his daughter was embarrassed. And I related to that though, because in Arizona, when we travel to Phoenix and Tucson and places like that, we know that a lot of that Southern Arizona, they prospered on the backs of our N aquifer. A lot of that was used to slurry coal so they can get powered up. And when you go in those areas, you see golf courses that are just flooded. You see lawns getting irrigated and that runoff from the lawns just going down the road. And this is where I joked around with Vice Chairwoman Cloud. I says, it reminds me of that old commercial. Some of you in the room may remember it, where Iron Eyes Cody went on top of the hill and looked down at the city and he saw all that pollution and a little tear came to his eye. I said, that's sometimes how I feel, when you see that. I joke about it, but in reality, I do have that emotion. I think a lot of us, from First Nations have that, even maybe others, when they see that, because when we're talking about sustainability, sustainability isn't only a Hopi question. Sustainability isn't only a First Nations question. Sustainability has to be an all of us question, and we all have to be the solution to how we're going to sustain a precious resource. And I think, well, I guess I should rephrase that. I know this is a wake-up call for everybody that's involved in this. And I think the nation, the world needs to take a look at this under a microscope, and maybe some have already figured out solutions, but to learn from what we're doing and maybe to learn from what we haven't done in the past. There's got to be a pathway forward. And that pathway forward for us as Indigenous people is making sure that our voices are heard. Just to add to that, the dynamics have shifted. In the past, First Nations had zero voice about the law of the river and how it was created. Today, differences are being set aside. We're coming together, a unique dynamic where our voices together are stronger. We refuse to be in the shadow any longer. We are here, and we've got a reason to fight, a justified reason to fight. It's the good fight. And I want everybody to come to the table and be a part of making sure that equity is involved here for everybody. As Hopis and as First Nations, we don't just think of ourselves, we think about the entire world. The world, we have respect for that and how everybody should be able to prosper. I can go on. I just want to leave it there for now, but I think we have a good place. I think we're hitting a reset button, and we have a lot of high-level individuals that spoke yesterday, today. We are going to be hearing from others, and we have to digest that information and put all that into perspective and start looking at the next steps. 2026 is going to get here quick, and we have to be able to put these puzzle pieces that are on the table, put them together to complete that picture on what it's going to look like. I'm encouraged, though. I'm encouraged, you all, that we have this opportunity to really do something great for this whole region. And I want to thank everybody. There's nobody insignificant in this room out there who has a perspective into this. We're all doing this because we all, I know, want to see better for the future. So I'm just going to leave it right there and give my colleagues on the panel an opportunity to speak as well. And I'm happy to answer any questions, I guess, as this conversation goes along. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Peck, why don't you do your magic here?
And he's going to do the magic first. And I think
Maybe.
we're good. Thank you.
Maybe we're good.
I think we're good. Maybe we're not good.
We're not exactly good. That's not a very impressive slide, Peck.
So this is what it looks like at night. We don't have a flashlight. And
Picture, right?
there are no stars.
This is Boulder in the winter.
So I've been lucky in my career, we'll solve it, right? To have run into this problem before. And we just talk and we hope for the best. So lots of things are happening here. All right. Oh, look at that. Look at that. So thank you, whoever did that. Makes it a lot easier, and most importantly, it makes it most efficient, because I can talk forever. And I just want to say it's wonderful to be here all with you. And I am in particular, I'm very honored to be on this panel with these two gentlemen, because I think we really do have an opportunity to do things different, not just in the basin, but for the United States and the world, and show that equity is a real thing. And it's also important that we're doing something for the whole region and doing something great together. And I think if we're going to do that, we have to consider climate change. I lived out here for 30 years. I lived 10 years here in Boulder and then moved down to Tucson. Still have a place up in the mountains and in the San Juans. So, I'm part of the basin. I've been part of the basin for as long as my kids have been alive. And we have a problem. And we've been talking about the problem. We're over allocating. We're not sharing the water with all of the partners who deserve the water. and who have already been allocated the water. But we're also dealing with climate change. And the bottom line of my talk today is to really highlight that the bottom line, and this is so, you'll listen to my talk, I hope, but if you don't, you'll at least get the point, is that climate change will drive the river into the ground. The ideas of stabilizing storage will be very hard to do. Coming up with a sustainable solution for this river will be very hard to do. And it's not just this river, there are a host of other things. But if you want to talk water, talk the Colorado and the Rio Grande, because they both share this problem of climate change is reducing the flows of the rivers. Warming is, okay? But fortunately, the good news is it's not too late to do something about it. And I know we're gonna have to put all our efforts into figuring out how to come up with an operating plan that shares the water in an equitable manner, and that's gonna take a hell of a lot of work. But I'm hoping you come away from this talk and this meeting thinking we can do more than just chew gum. We can chew gum and we can talk at the same time. We can solve multiple problems and we can work together to solve climate change because there are a lot of benefits of that. Okay, let's see where we stand. This is Brad Udall is back here, and he led this effort a few years ago, actually almost 10 years ago. It seems like just yesterday, where we wanted to look at the river, and we brought together all sorts of climate scientists before we wrote this paper, who worked on the river to figure out what it is going to happen to the river as climate change proceeds. And all we did in this paper really is try and simplify everything and down to the basics so everybody outside the scientific community could understand what the hell the scientists were talking about. The big thing is what's happened since we wrote this paper back in 2017. Several things have happened. So this is an updated version of the figure in the paper. It's kind of iconic that Brad produced. And it shows at the top the combined storage of Meade and Powell. It's continued to go down since we wrote the paper. Flows have stayed low since we wrote the paper. They're not going down that much more, but they're staying low. Precipitation, it surprised us because when we wrote the paper, precipitation hadn't really gone down. Now it's clearly going down. And what you can see are different colors of lines. The dotted red line shows the trend over the period of record. The blue line shows the decadal variations. And then there's temperature on the bottom. Temperature that was the big story that we were trying to make sure everyone understood. It's the temperature that is really something that we got to worry about because it is responsible for half the flow reductions, and temperature continues to go up. Okay, we're in the 25th year of this drought, and when it goes over 20 years, scientists like to call it a mega drought. The first mega drought that we've had in North America since Europeans came. But as we know, there have been other mega droughts in this region. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, just to summarize where the science is now, warming is driving up to half of the flow declines. All of the climate models, all of them, every single one, dozens of climate models, hundreds of simulations, they all show the same thing. As long as we keep putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we're talking CO2, carbon dioxide, methane, and a few others, but it's mostly carbon dioxide due to fossil fuel burning. As long as we keep doing that, it's going to keep warming. When we stop doing that, it'll stop warming. That will be the so-called new normal, okay? All of the studies also highlight that precipitation is important, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that. You all know that if it doesn't rain, we got a problem, okay? And there's natural variability that is going to continue to be very influential in the basin with respect to the river. And the problem is, however, is that climate models are not in agreement on what's going to happen to the trend in precipitation so far. Look at the trend in precipitation over the last 100 years since we had rain gauge record. Do you see precipitation going up? No, precipitation is flat or going down. Okay, there are climate models, and there's a paper that was just published that you probably saw the press release about that said, We found a climate model where the rain goes up, okay? That is not the majority of the climate scientists or the models. It's really hard to find simulations where the precipitation goes up. But because of natural variability, in the study that was just published, for example, is a very good point. Because of natural variability, we are going to get wet periods still. You know, and that we're not going to talk about today, but that's a reason why the Glen Canyon Dam, it helps protect Boulder Dam, you know, and that's important because precipitation could go up. But the point is that climate change is driving warmer temperatures, and all bets are off on what it's going to do to precipitation. But there's the evidence. I like to look at what Mother Earth is telling us, and she's telling us it ain't changing in this region. And the science says that too. There's no significant trend in precipitation. Okay, so that's the consensus or the state of the science, is that human-caused climate change, both warming and precipitation change, will likely continue to drive the river flows down. Okay, now here's the new stuff. I just want to say that the science over the last 9 years has confirmed what we knew, you know, a decade ago. But here's some new stuff too. During periods of low precipitation, and we're in one of those periods now, driven by climate variability, doesn't seem like there's a trend due to global warming, the full impacts of the warming will be felt. What that means is if you have low precipitation, you're going to get a lot of the effects of the warming, and the warming is just going to get greater and greater. And the warming is therefore going to do its thing with the water supply, with the flows. It's going to deplete them. But the new stuff I'm going to show you in a second indicates that this could be more devastating than we thought, because we haven't, as climate scientists, thought very carefully about, we just don't know as much about groundwater as we should know. And there are multiple people in the room I've already talked to, whether you're from Kansas, or you're from Arizona, or you're from up here in Colorado, or wherever. You know, we're depleting the groundwater, but Mother Nature is also depleting the groundwater because of what we're doing with our greenhouse gas emissions. That warming is causing the vegetation to take water, move it back into the atmosphere, instead of allowing it to get into the ground. So when the snow melts, teeny little fraction actually makes it to the river. What we're getting in the river is water that, you know, precipitated quite a long time ago. Okay, but if we keep pulling water out of the ground, it causes a problem. I'll show you what I mean in just a second. The first thing I want to show you is this new science. And this is a paper that was just published in 2022. And it shows the flows of the Colorado reconstructed using tree rings, going back not just 1,000 years like we've seen in previous papers by Dave Miko and others at the University of Arizona, but these same guys have now, men and women, have reconstructed it back 2,000 years. And the point here, which I think particularly our Native colleagues know because their people have lived through these, there have been mega droughts in the past. In the Southwest, we're in mega drought country. And I just colored in a few of these droughts just to highlight they happen a lot. And I also wanted to highlight the purpose of this paper, which is to highlight that in 2000 AD, there was a drought that lasted 80 years. It's the worst drought we've seen in the last 2,000 years on the Colorado. So during these droughts, these really long ones or the shorter ones, the important thing is the temperature will be fully felt. There is no compensating effect of precipitation if you're in a drought. Now here's the other study I was alluding to. This paper just came out this year. And these guys were looking at groundwater dynamics in a basin in Colorado to get an idea of how does groundwater to factor into all of this and the vegetation. We knew when Brad and I wrote the paper back in 2017 that the dominant way warming takes water out of the basin and keeps it from getting in the river is through vegetation. The warming allows it sucks the moisture. The atmosphere can hold more moisture, so as it gets warmer, it can suck more moisture out of the land surface and the vegetation. But the vegetation, as we all know, if it's really dry and hot, you got to water more because the vegetation is going to release more moisture in the atmosphere, and it's going to wilt if you don't give it enough water. So that's basically what's happening. The other thing that's happening is the growing season is getting longer. You know, this winter is ending earlier and starting later, so there's more vegetation growing more of the year. And those really are the main reason why the water is not getting into the river. Instead, as it warms, worse and worse. But what these guys pointed out, and read this quote, I'm going to leave it up there for a minute because it's really important, is that because of this, the groundwater in the basin, the headwaters of the basin we're talking about here, you know, the water that gets into Lake Powell, because of this, more and more of the water, when it does precipitate, snow or rain, goes into the ground, and it's dry, you know, it's dry in the ground, so it's not going to make it into the river. And if you had really good eyes, you can see that in the end, in a given year, all the precipitation that falls in the upper basin, only about 2% actually gets into the river. And what's interesting is that, you know, so the river is going to get what has rained and snowed before, but not if the groundwater is being depleted by this warming. And that means, this quote was really got my eye, and it really worried me, is that in a warmer climate, guaranteed as long as we keep burning fossil fuels, the losses will be most severe during dry periods. Well, we know we all have lots of dry periods. And it may not be able to, flows to the river may not be able to recover to historic levels, what we're used to in the past, even during simulated wet periods. So the point of my talk today is just to say, even if those few climate models that say it's going to get wetter are right, it might not be good enough. The warming is what's really doing damage to our river, and we've got to stop the warming. And the only way to stop the warming is to stop the emissions of fossil fuel, of greenhouse gases, primarily from fossil fuels. Okay. So why am I telling you all this? I think everyone in the room is like, understands why I'm passionate about this and why I think it's so important. I'll give the talk anywhere you want. The important thing is that we understand in the basin, we got to work together, not just to come up with operating rules, not just to share the water equitably, but to stop climate change, or else. Carly Jicarilla yesterday pointed out we don't want Band-Aids. We're only working on Band-Aids if we're not dealing with climate change, because it's going to get worse and worse. We want a sustainable plan. Well, we're not going to get a sustainable plan. It's going to be like 2007 over again if we don't deal with climate change. We want to stabilize storage. We're having a tough time with that. Why? Because of climate change, but you know, of course, the way we use our water. If we're just going to do it by essentially managing demand, well, we'll just use less and less water from here until eternity. But if we stop climate change, we actually stabilize the situation. We get sustainability, okay? Climate change is accelerating. It's not too late, but we better get going on this. It's having major impacts around the world. It's hammering the Colorado River, but it's possible to stop it. And when we stop it, we save money because of the impacts of the climate change. We make money. For example, if you put solar panels out on your pasture or your farm, you know, you can do it in a way that you can continue to produce and get money from the energy. You also protecting ecosystem services and biodiversity. You're also cleaning up the air and water pollution associated with fossil fuels. It's like a no-brainer to do this, but we got to all do it together for it to work. Here's just the record of global temperature since we had a global thermometer record. And I just wanted to highlight 2023. One of my colleagues says it was, and I don't know where he got this word, was gobsmacking when he saw this, because it was such a big jump in global temperatures. And we talk about trying to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial, which is what we agreed to in Paris, all the nations of the world. And we're already at 1.2. The last 12 months, we've been at over 1.4 above pre-industrial. So we're warming the planet a lot harder than we thought we were. It's having impacts that are a lot worse and faster than we thought. 2023 was also notable because it had a big jump in the number of billion-dollar or more climate disasters around the world. 63 of them, the last record was 57, set a couple of years ago. But you know, as the heat wave in the US settles in, look, it'll be in the news. People are gonna be suffering in Florida and southern Texas and Yuma and the Imperial Valley where it's really, really hot. These temperatures are getting deadly. In Europe in 2003, 70,000 people have prematurely died because of a heat wave. And another heat wave just in 2023, so just, or 22, another 60,000 people in Europe died prematurely. These are having huge effects, not just in India and Indonesia and Africa, but in Europe. No wonder Europe is working so hard to stop climate change. They got Putin doing his thing, and they got people dying, okay? You've seen the floods this year in Brazil. You've seen heat waves in West Africa. We're gonna have a heck of a hurricane season probably because the ocean temperatures in the Atlantic are warmer than they've ever been this year. You know, there's a lot of reasons to do this, but for us in the room, it's been said over and over yesterday, water is our livelihoods. Water is our culture. Water is our history. Water is everything in the basin. So we have more of a reason to do something about climate change, I would argue, than even those poor guys and women in Miami who are just gonna have to go inside all the time. Right? Duh, okay? So the warming so far, 1.2 degrees C. If we just proceed with the actions and what people or policies that are already in place around the world, we are making a difference. The Biden administration is making a huge difference with the legislation and what's happening in America. But we'll still end up with 2.5 to 3 degrees C warming. So that's 2 times or 3 times the impacts we're getting already. That's 2 to 3 times the impacts we're already getting on hurricanes, heat waves, depletion of water in the Colorado River. Okay? But we can actually, if we do more, and it's in particular, if we all get together and work in a bipartisan way, I know that word is really hard on people these days, but if the basin states could move out on climate change, it might just change things in the US and around the world. We have to do an impossible job, some people have said, to manage the river equitably. Okay, we have to do that. But I would argue that we have to do this too. Why not just do them at the same time? Okay, because then the climate change will be far less severe and we'll be able to enjoy a lot more water in the river than we would get otherwise. So I live in the Great Lakes now. Come and visit if you want to see 20% of the world's unfrozen fresh water. It's really nice, but it's a long ways from here. The basin has to solve this problem as a basin working together. Thank you.
Thank you, Peck. That was heavy, wow. I appreciate you looking for optimistic messages in there, Peck, but I gotta tell you, for ranking the talks so far based on their level of optimism, I don't think you're winning.
I got to see the Great Lakes.
As we transition now to Daryl, let me remind you that, again, we're gonna do the Q&A now after Daryl, so you can start sending questions in, and Celine and Jason over here are compiling those. So I'm sure that last talk will generate several questions. Daryl, you ready? Yep. Or you can use your lapel mic.
I'm going to use this. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me? Okay. All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Daryl Vigil, and I co-facilitate the Water and Tribes Initiative. And very grateful to be here and to be able to speak on this particular area. And I have to laugh myself too, because believe me, we tried to get somebody else for this segment, but and we have an incredible leadership team, as I've mentioned. Some of them are helping out today, and I absolutely appreciate, their help, to do this work and to facilitate, the conversation. And I think, our two visionaries in our leadership team are Nora McDowell and Garrett Boesiger. I think all of them are visionaries, but those in particular, Nora, past chair of the Fort Mojave tribe, and numerous terms that she had there, and always talking about a vision, and always talking about how they're guided by that vision of who they are as a people, and how they, translate and communicate that and give that to the future generations so that they can continue to build on that vision for themselves. And Garrett Boesiger, he's in Paris, apparently. Thanks, Garrett. He's been working with the National Wildlife Federation and absolutely doing this work a lot longer than I have in the basin in terms of helping create different visions for different conversations. And why is that important, and hopefully I'll talk about that here in a minute. But before I start, I really wanted to acknowledge, and we haven't had a chance and an opportunity to do this yet, but last year, in the buildup of conversations around Colorado River policy and future operations and management of the river, we really got to have some frank discussions starting last year, and they've progressed into numerous other conversations that that have never existed because they needed to be created. And there's a gentleman that showed up at every CRUA, and he was here for last year's conference, and he actually, created a situation at this year's Family Farm Alliance to have the first tribal panel at the Family Farm Alliance ever. And if you knew a gentleman named Mr. Pat O'Toole, you knew that he would invite you to his ranch because he was so proud of what they were doing. And he wanted to show you how they were making a difference. And he passed, right before the conference or soon before the conference. And I saw his granddaughter here yesterday. I don't know if she's here today or not. Are you here? And I told her I was going to do this. But I just wanted to say that because, those of you who knew Pat O'Toole, he was very committed, and we didn't agree on everything, and that's for sure. But, there were some common values, that had him make available a conversation at the organization that he ran. And so very grateful for that, and so thank you, Pat, and you'll be missed. And I still plan to make that trip to your ranch so I can see what's going on there. So wanted to do that first. And I wanted to acknowledge Brad Udall. Yep, and you escaped being the skunk this year. And I so appreciate the work. And I talk about Brad all the time because, when I first got into this work 14 years ago, wow, he was absolutely talking to anybody about this is our future, and this is what it's based in, this fact, this science. And that seems to be, that a lot of people and entities seem to be really resistant to. And just like now with Peck, wow, that's staggering. And, if that's not a call to action, I don't know what is. And so I talk a lot about, for tribes, it's an existential threat, absolutely a double whammy of one. For the human race, it absolutely is as well. And last year, I so appreciate it, Brad, because, and some other talks that I heard him talk at, challenge the science community and the academic community to stand behind their work and the truth and the fact behind their work, and not to manipulate it for your purposes or other people's purposes to get the outcomes that they want. And so I said that first. And the second thing is, I just want to thank Chairman Tim, because I'm so grateful, to be an indigenous person, to be from Jicarilla Apache Nation, from Zia Pueblo, and from Jemez Pueblo, because, my life was much different before I got into the water policy world. And water gave me voice, water gave me purpose, and water gave me clarity. And those are the things that, my grandparents taught me, and what do those things provide you? If you lived 1,000 years of observation in this basin, in terms of the observations of nature and the observations of human behavior as well, to understand and get to a point where, I was instilled with this thinking of this personal responsibility as a human being, and to be ingrained, then the only way to execute that behavior is with from an extreme context of humility, to know that I'm just part of a greater whole. And what is that responsibility that comes along with that? And it's amazing to me, because thousands of years of that observation, not only of nature and of human nature, but, to be able to translate that orally, over thousands of years, and to get it really exact in terms of those things that have been prophesized, but probably is more grounded in the understanding and the behavior of human beings, and those things that happen to us as well, like at Chaco Canyon and those kind of things. So I wanted to say that, because it's really important, to understand, Chairman Tim's excitement for his people that he's been working on for 30 years. But guess what? He's just starting now.
Uh-oh.
And so when Dr. Matt McKinney and I started this whole conversation of the Water and Tribes Initiative, it was grounded in, what I know as how to be an indigenous person. And that the only way that I knew how to be of help was to be willing to be of service, and be willing to be of service, whatever that looked like. And so one of the things that we started with is, we better find out, what's going on in the basin. I had been working for been the 10 tribes chairperson and my tribe's water administrator. And so I had a lot of perspective from a certain angle, but we really wanted to find out, because there seemed to be a lot of contentiousness in the basin. What are people really thinking, and what do they really feel? And so, we first started a process of, hold on. Is that the next one? Yeah, so we started looking at, well, how can we do that? And we worked with the 10 Tribes Partnership to begin with. We helped develop a strategic plan for them, and that organization is still in existence, but it represents 10 tribes, and absolutely saw the need to communicate to the broader 30 tribal sovereigns in the basin. So one of the first things that we did was we went out and we did an interview process of 150 people or more, over 100 different organizations, a cross-section of the basin, tribes, states, feds, farmers, large-scale ag, everybody, and water providers, anybody who would talk to us, we talked to them. And one of the things, and that's on our website, and it's called Toward a Sense of the Basin. And a couple really important things came out of that document. The first question that we asked is, what is your personal relationship to the Colorado River? And the second one was, what is your professional relationship to the Colorado River? Invariably, whoever we were interviewing would spend most of the time talking about their personal experience of the Colorado River and the values that were around that, that they had. And then they would barely talk about their work, but really quickly it became apparent that for a lot of folks that we interviewed, that their personal values were oppositional to their professional values. And so, there was that dynamic right away. And so one of the things that came out of that as well was like, wow, a few different things that we need to do this collectively, but everybody was interested in the values of a healthy, sustainable, living Colorado River that provided water for all. And, I had the absolute privilege of leading a group of 10 leaders in the 10 Tribes Partnership to create that vision statement. And it took 6 months to create that vision statement because they wanted to be careful and understand that this was what would guide them into the future. And they wanted something that was going to be really reflective of who they are as human beings and as indigenous human beings, and who they are in terms of representation of those sovereign tribes they represented. And they came up with that vision statement that talks about leading from a spiritual mandate. That is just so powerful to me, because that's been the thousands of years of existence, has been based in that practice. And so the other component of it was that tribal water and tribal water rights needed to be acknowledged. And that was almost universal as well. And so, yeah, we may be arguing about, allocations and as Carly said yesterday, this is not about allocation. It's about dam operations and management. And that's the reality of it. And so where do all the other transformations need to happen? And you all have this document in front of you now. And one of the things that we did at Water and Tribes Initiative is we really tried to make sure that, there was data available that maybe didn't exist before, and the creation of data that hopefully was helpful to the rest of everybody in the basin in terms of what was being created and what had already been created. And so there's, you have the 10 Tribes vision statement, and incredibly powerful there. You can see the elements of that. Water is life. Water is the giver and sustainer of life. And as I heard somebody from a river tribe say as well, an addendum to that, water can take life too. And so we need to honor and respect that it has that ability. Water is a sacred and spiritual element of the partnership tribes. And so, and it goes on to talk about how that water needs to be protected for each of the membership tribes. But so we looked and we found other visions. We talked to other folks that were in the process of this process of thinking about the future and what the future looks like. Because if you don't know where you're going, how are you going to get there? And if you need, as Pac said, what does equity and inclusion look like in terms of thinking about a vision for the future? And so, you have these examples of visions that all have common components in them in terms of the underlying values for the river and the people and the environment in the Colorado River Basin. And we show these things to you because, that's the foundation. It's already kind of been set to some degree, as Chairman said, processes have been set in motion already. And, once you create that vision, then whether or not you're actually talking about it or whatever, it's been created and it's in existence. And so all of these lend, an idea of what a possible future could look like based on the foundation that we built. So, we see this resolution of sustainability, and it's on page 5 of your policy brief. And it really, again, talks about a commitment of, how taking those elements of the vision statements and really putting them into a format of, how do we actually utilize, the common values and themes from those vision statements to actually forward the conversations that are happening in the policy world and in the capacity world in terms of conversations about, access to resources and those kind of things. And so, again, every single conversation that I've been a part of recently that has a lot of weight and that are important conversations, like the Upper Basin Dialogue, which is the tribes in the Upper Basin and a host of NGOs, they started by creating a common vision together. And one of the, and again, to create clarity and create an understanding of each other. And one of the first things that came out of those conversations is that tribes are sovereigns and NGOs are not. And, and given those kind of relationships, what are the differences between the two? Because everything seems to get collapsed onto each other. Then we try to figure out how to segregate those things out. And so, really looking at that resolution again to forward and ideas of, your ideas and the collective in the basin ideas about what are those values that are going to drive us, into the future. And so when we think about that, exactly it, about how do we move that vision into action, and what are those challenges and those opportunities, and what is the best way to affirm a vision for the Colorado River system? Because as we've heard the last 2 days, we've got to do this together. We've got to do this together, and it needs to be done together. But the reality is that there aren't structures and mechanisms to have that happen yet. The reality is still that there is no structural inclusion for tribes in terms of decision making, regardless of where we're at in this conversation. And so there was a tribal leader that used to always talk about, it's just all talk until something is actually moved by law or by structure or by legislation. And for tribes right now, yeah, we can be visionary and we can talk about, our experience of what visions can provide in terms of building ownership and understanding and building community in terms of that ownership of a collective vision. But, that's the reality. There still is not structural inclusion, and it hasn't really been determined what that's going to look like. And we talk about things like, well, we need to be real flexible and think of unique ideas and solutions. But again, the structures don't incentivize that. The structures incentivize doing what we used to do, because that's what we know. And that's what the law allows. And so even though, the Upper Basin tribes signed a historic memo with the Upper Colorado River Commission, it's all, a kind of, it has no teeth except because the law doesn't allow us to really make any decisions at that level, but it does set at least the trend of a willingness to work together. And until we actually create those mechanisms for change in terms of structural inclusion, equity, and then, we're going to have the same results. And based on what Peck just showed, that's catastrophic. It's already catastrophic, to Native Americans, because Hopi just starting, wow. And then you have 100 years of development and economic activity that others have been able to engage in, and just starting. Wow. I mean, that's the diversity of this basin. So it really, really begs the question, and we've talked a little bit about it yesterday, about, you know, how do we make this all work to the best of our ability? And we hear a lot of things like, it's gonna be hard, you're gonna have to, everybody's gonna have to hurt. I'm like, I don't wanna hurt. And you know, it's already painful. It's already has been painful for us as well as indigenous communities, given our lack of inability. And then during a global pandemic, you know, not being able to be self-determined to get clean water to your people. I can't imagine what that makes a tribal leader feel like. You know, to have hands tied, not to save his people's lives. Because we died at almost twice the rate. We got it more than 3.5 times the rate of other people. In this country today, there's still 19 times more likelihood that, I mean, tribes are 19 times more likely not to have indoor plumbing. 19 times. And, you know, I'm still from the generation of, you know, it's cold to use a bathroom outside in the winter. And so, you know, this is, you know, becomes really, really important, you know, for the work that, you know, we're doing at Water and Tribes Initiative, and the support that we get from our leadership team, and the support that we get from, you know, the people who support us with resources. And very, very honored and grateful that our work gets to get supported. But guess what we talk about with our support resource people as well? It's about these things. Because, you know, they have visions too about, you know, what it is that they want to execute, and how does that tie into what we're doing? And so, you know, the biggest thing about this vision process, as you can see, is and the examples and the proof is in this room, is that we're actually having these conversations. If this conference was 14 years ago, you know, this would not be happening. Because I was there 14 years ago when 10 Tribes Partnership was jumping up and down because we got excluded from the basin study. And that was just kind of the first recognition of like where we were really at. And so when I talk about an existential threat for tribes, yeah, it's one for all humanity, but particularly for tribes, given the examples that you've heard the last few days. You know, and so when we think about, you know, a common vision, you know, and these are a lot of the conversations that you're hearing. You know, what is the best way to affirm a vision for the river system? What are the elements of a common vision are appropriate to guide the development of post-2026 operational guidelines? Understanding that, you know, they're limited in scope and there need to be parallel process. Well, we need to identify those parallel processes and not assume that the federal government's going to take care of it or the state government's going to take care of it, because there's been too many of those assumptions. There's been assumptions about, you know, the relationship with tribes and the states they reside in, and they're usually not good relationships. They're better now, but historically they haven't been good. So you have a situation where tribes within their own states aren't recognized as sovereigns, and that's changing. Slowly, but some of those things just happened just recently in my state. What elements can or should be addressed in other forums and processes? You know, I think we've heard a lot of that this last 2 days, you know, about where it should be addressed and how it should be addressed. And we had our state leaders, we had our federal leaders here. We heard a little bit from Mexico. You know, we have this information. And if it needs to be told, and we utilize these forums and like CRUA as well, and tribal law conferences and whatnot to get messaging out. And so I think, that seems to be something that needs to continue. Which elements can be addressed sooner or later? Which elements require a long-term plan? And again, I'll Hopi as an example, and my Pueblo people, thousands and thousands of years in this basin. And being that, a lot of, the tribes are just starting to be able to develop and think about utilizing their water rights. This is a generational issue. A lot of this infrastructure on tribal reservations hasn't been built yet. And so that means that not only, and as it was said, this money is going to dry up really quickly. And what's going to happen then? And so really, the urgency of trying to figure out mechanisms and pathways to ensure, that we get as much structural inclusion and that those infrastructure issues in terms of basic access to clean water are fulfilled. And that true conservation doesn't start until everybody has access to clean water. And so I think, how can cultural and ecological values be integrated into the modeling and decision-making? How can they not be? They already are. It's already happening. And when we think about those ecological values, it always makes me chuckle, because somehow or another, we exclude ourselves as human beings from the environment and the ecosystem. But guess what? We're a part of it. We're a part of that food chain. And, it's indiscriminately, we don't need that fish. Guess what? Something else eats that fish, and blah, 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 blah. And guess what? We're part of that. So, I don't want to participate in our own apocalypse. I really don't. And so when we talk about cultural values, wow, there's so much to be learned from your indigenous partners, your indigenous friends, your indigenous communities about how to be resilient and sustainable. We had to adopt governance structures that didn't fit us so that we could live. Patriarchal controlling governance structures. Guess what? They're still there. And they're still active, and they work really well. Thanks for teaching us those things. And how can we strike that balance? And really, again, that's what I was ingrained with. And when I'm in, whether I'm the kiva or the teepee, and you listen to the spiritual leaders talk about that, it's about balance. Everything needs to be in balance, because, and you hear, the spiritual leaders, that I've listened to in the Pueblos and like in Carissa, and that's it, like they understand, like this isn't right. Something's going on here, because this is not how we've experienced it over thousands of years. And so that becomes a real concern to them, because there's an innate understanding that we're stewards. We're humans, and that's part of our responsibility. And so, how is it that we, and it's so wild that we're asking for inclusion. We're asking to contribute, to the processes. We're asking for basic human rights and equity. And the world is watching. Absolutely, they're watching to see what we're going to do and how we're going to react. And I'm pretty hopeful, and I remain hopeful, that things are going to continue on this trajectory. But as Chairman said, it's going to take every single one of us and that positive intention and that willingness and that open-mindedness, to be able to move forward. And I think we've seen a whole lot of that. But again, at the end of the day, if we don't create that structural inclusion in terms of tribal recognition of tribal sovereignty and self-determination, it's not going to be good for us for the next 20 years, because we've just started to build economies. We've just started to build infrastructure, after 100 years of activity already. And the basin needs to know this. absolutely needs to know this. Those people in your backyards need to know, the plight and what has happened and where we're at right now and the realities of it. Because this is going to take legislative action. And if there's not an understanding, and there hasn't been, and that's what we've done the last 14 years, is really try to educate the basin about the indigenous people that are still here. And a lot of you have heard me talk about this over and over again, but a vision can be only supported by the structures and the relationships that, that are created out of that vision and the ownership of that vision. And the reality is that, if we don't have that inclusion and that ability to be self-determined, then, people die again. I keep bringing that back to that, but it was one of the most heartbreaking things to see, during COVID. What do we do as indigenous people? Was the very thing that we shouldn't have been doing. We got together, we prayed. And the things that we had done for 1,000 years, and that just made it worse. And those aren't things that we created. So anyway, I really wanted to thank all of you for listening to that, because visions are incredibly important because they set the foundation of being able to imagine a joint future together. And then it starts to hopefully provide some clarity of what are those joint elements that need to be created so that we have ownership, because there's an urgency to this, and nursing Mother Earth back to health is at the absolute tip of that. And what is it that we can do to really incentivize that? We can acknowledge each other's humanity, and we can acknowledge each other's basic human rights and needs. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Daryl. And I pick on Daryl a lot, but I hold Daryl in the highest regard, and thank you for participating and putting this all together. What are we looking like in terms of questions? We got a bunch? All right. Fire away.
All right, I think that's my cue. As with yesterday, please add questions into the queue. Really appreciate it. That's what causes the dialogue to happen. That's what determines what gets posed to the panelists. So I really appreciate it if you put yourself out there and add content to the queue. And with respect to the existing content, if there's stuff that you want to see discussed, please give a thumbs up in the queue so you can communicate that. This is a democratic process, right? All right, so with that stage set, there's really two questions that focus on Native peoples and two questions that focus on climate change that are at the top of the queue. And I'm going to go with the questions focusing on Native peoples first. The first one has to do with the term that's been thrown around a few times now of structural inclusion. Structural inclusion for Native peoples in Colorado River management, or in, I guess, relationship building with the Colorado River. The way the question is phrased is this: which specific structures need to be put in place to incentivize tribal inclusion?
You want me to tell them?
You,
I'm not going to answer that one.
Okay. So, yeah, in terms of the structure, again, I think that's being imagined, but right now there's acknowledgement that there's a parity of sovereignty between state government and tribal sovereigns. And then we have the federal government. And when we talk about structural inclusion, right now the decision makers are the 7 basin states and the federal government. And there's been an assumption that trust responsibility was carried out. And maybe so in some cases, maybe not. And there was an assumption that, there's a good relations with inside the states that tribes reside in with their state tribal sovereign partner. But as we've found out over the last few years, that was absolutely not true. And, some of the relationships with the states is at its infancy still. It's better than it was. But remember, we weren't supposed to be here. We were supposed to be gone by now. And so all these structures were built in mind not to have us here. And so since we are still here, we should make accommodations for that and to be a decision maker for our own water and to create a mechanism. And so when we talked yesterday about, the renegotiation of the operational guidelines, we talk about those parallel processes that need to happen alongside of the creation of those new operational guidelines and management processes that hopefully will include, the structural inclusion of tribal sovereigns into that decision-making process for themselves. And there's always this disclaimer, well, that's way too many people to be making decisions. If you have 30 tribal sovereigns, or how did Governor Lewis, the 38 sovereigns. Well, if it can be done with 50 states, why can't it be done with 38 sovereigns? And in terms of having a collective, a place where, tribes could have an individual seat, because that is what, will acknowledge and recognize and honor their sovereignty, to have all 30 recognized, not to have a tribal seat. You should have 30 tribal seats in whatever that looks like. And so I'm not sure, and it's still being in development in terms of, what that structural inclusion will look like at a federal level. But, there's been tons of inroads that have been made in terms of that state-tribal relationship. And a lot of it is historic, has been mentioned in terms of the creation of these MOUs, the fact that, people are on state boards now and interstate stream commissions. And so there's starting to be some, input in terms of our relationship with the states. But that relationship still is, we're on state boards. And so how do we start to create those mechanisms internally of state tribal relationships? So there's actually that sovereign to sovereign conversation going on, not sovereign to ward, we're going to allocate you some state resources type of process. So it needs to happen at that level as well. And then, when we think about this international conversation, absolutely, we've been asking, well, why aren't we included in the conversation of the minutes? Well, because that structure doesn't provide that for us legally. And so now, you've heard it that, from Roberto Salmon, that absolutely there needs to be tribal inclusion in this process as well. And Mexico is saying that to the United States. And so, so whatever gets created needs to take in mind, that there's a recognition by the federal government that we are domestic sovereigns and we are at parity at sovereignty with the states, and we need to be treated equally.
Chairman Tim?
Yeah, thank you. Great response to that, Daryl. I want to back up just a little bit first. I wanted to mention this before I started speaking, but I really do want to thank the Ute Nation tribes for hosting us on their beautiful land, right? Wow, it's incredible here. So thank you for, allowing us to be on your indigenous lands, and I'm really, honored to be here sharing, this beautiful scenery with you all. And I want to also go back to yesterday morning when I was preparing to come over here. It does have I think, a unique segue into the question that we're talking about. I got in the elevator yesterday morning, and while we were waiting for the elevator to come up, I ran into a gentleman that was getting on the same elevator. Good morning, hey, how's it going? And big plans today. Oh yeah, I'm here to see my son practice football at a higher level, I guess. And I'm like, oh man, it's so beautiful out right now. Never been to Boulder, so I was like, part of me was thinking conference, go watch kids play football, and I was like, man, that would be great to go, sit outside, enjoy the weather, watch football. And he looked at me, he said, well, you seem like you're on a mission, brother. You got to take care of your people and get out there and, get what you need to do done for them. And we were chatting a little bit more, and he says, that's what he went back to. He says, you look like you're on a mission to help your people. You got to get out there and restore that balance, brother. And that resonated with me. And, I thanked him for that. And I told him, I says, wow. I said, that's deep, man. And I says, I'm going to share that with everybody. So, and as indigenous people, really, that's what we're doing here. We're bringing that indigenous knowledge. And it's not so much our voices. This is voices from time immemorial, from our elders that are no longer here, that have been passed on to our elders, that have passed it on to others, and that have passed it on to us now. And it's their lavai, their voices that we're sharing with everybody here. Why? To help restore that balance. And I was listening intently yesterday when it comes to this. So what specific structures need to be put in place that creates tribal inclusion? Listening to the state panel, I appreciated a lot of what they shared. It was educational for me on the process that's moving forward. One of the panelists, when the question had been brought up, I think prior, is making sure that tribes, Native voices are heard, but that's not enough. We talked about having a seat at the table, right? And so one of the state panelists mentioned, well, this comment was made earlier by one of the tribal leaders, and the comment that I heard was, there is no table. We're listening to everybody. Everybody has a role and participation in this. While I'm encouraged that Native tribes' voices are getting stronger and are being taken into consideration in the formulation of this whole process, I struggle. I struggle with that statement as a tribal leader. Because when you look at it through the lens of a tribal indigenous person, as a tribal leader, there definitely is a table. And we are not still included in it. I thought it was kind of a soft, strategic, creative way to kind of move past that question to say there is no table. Again, I might be speaking for myself. Others may feel the same way, but I'm still under the belief there is a table, and we are not quite there yet. While we're inching closer to it, we're not quite there yet. So some of the comments that you shared is really leading into that, where we have to get past that. We've been through so many bureaucratic issues, federal, state, local, even tribal, and we've broken down a lot of those barriers, and we've got to continue this momentum forward where we're definitely a part of that. Why? Is because indigenous people help bring that balance to everything. And in Hopi, we're in a place, again, prophecy has brought us to Getches-Wilkinson. Getches-Wilkinson means a world in chaos, a world that is not balanced any longer. We're off our axis, climate, it's all part of that. And again, I go back to what was taught to us culturally in this prophecy. And if we can bring that indigenous knowledge back to the table and be part of that seat at the table, we can help restore that, get the earth back on its axis, where everything is working in harmony, not just for us here in this area, but for the entire world. So when we're talking about structural inclusion, we still have a way to go, but there's work that needs to be done. I'm encouraged about the steps we're taking, and I'm hoping that the voices and comments that are being shared, not only by us, but everybody in the room, will be considered, and we need to make that happen. Thank you.
Wow. Thank both of you for that. No surprise that while you were speaking, what you had to say raised additional questions within the audience pertaining to Native peoples, but to be fair in terms of time, I think it would be wise to shift to the major climate change question, or I should say the climate change question that garnered the most interest within the queue. And the question actually relates to science communication. Yeah, science communication. I'm going to embellish on it a little bit, but the question as initially posed is this: what could the water community do to better communicate the connection between climate change and water supply to decision makers and the public? My embellishment is, do you see the current state of science communication lacking in this regard?
Absolutely. But it comes back to really, I think, two things. One is, comes back to relationships. We need to figure out how to build relationships. We all know that there are difficulties in this country right now with different groups not able to talk to each other. The way to restore balance is to build relationships. But it's also important to realize that it's climate change and climate action has to be just as the solutions to the Colorado River have to be just. What does justice mean? It means different things to different people. Obviously, it means equity, but it also means everybody has to see a benefit to these actions. And by that, I mean, so in Michigan, where I've only been a short time, but I've been there working very hard in rural communities, trying to ensure that people in the rural communities understand the benefits of climate action to them, their families, and to their communities. And in Michigan, a lot of rural communities, we have an amazing agricultural heritage in Michigan. I didn't realize it, but next to maybe Washington, we have the most diverse crops. And I think Colorado has a lot too, but it's amazing in Michigan. And yet a lot of the rural communities are hollowing out. People are moving to the cities. And I think this is something we see around the country. Young people want to be in the cities where the action is and all this. But part of this is that these communities are now lacking money for schools, money for police, money for fire, money for all the things that they normally value in a community. And one way to get that money back in there is to work on climate solutions, because climate solutions bring money into communities, whether it's charging stations bringing people with money to charge go to lunch in your community, or it's solar or it's wind. Figuring out how to do that, though, in a way that works for the people requires to have relationships, to understand their needs and their desires. And so that's a way I think we have to proceed everywhere. And you're asking about communication. Communication is really, how do we build relationships? Because what do relationships give us? They give us trust. We have to start rebuilding trust. And people have to understand that we're not there. And I think, boy, we're hearing it in spades at this meeting. We're not here to screw other people. We're here to help each other. And that has to be the approach we take, or we're not working together. Okay? And so it's the same thing, I think, with climate action on a different level. So what do we have to do? Everyone in the room has to go back to their communities and talk about climate change. And not just talk to your family members who are already like on the same page with you, but talk to those who are, unsure about what's going on with climate change. We've already heard this. We know this. Everyone feels climate change, but they feel it in different ways, and they might not want to talk about it, but talk about it. And if you need climate scientists to come into your community and give a talk, I mean, we can find people who are willing to give these talks, like me and Brad and others, and have not a one-way delivery of information, but a conversation. So everyone sort of starts to understand, what is it that I can get out of doing what's right for climate? Because doing what's right for climate, at least we know it's right for the river, but it's right for maybe air pollution. Maybe it's right for animals and fish. We'll keep that fish alive. The point is that solving climate change is solving a lot of other problems too, but it has to work for everybody. And that means it's not something that can be imposed. So it's very, to me, listening to this conversation about water and the tribes, it resonates because I've been spending my whole career worried about, we can't impose climate action on people, whether they're native people or they're not. We have to start figuring out how to work together and how to build relationships and how to build trust. And I think once we do that, the communication is the easy part.
Okay, thank you so much. The next question circles back to Chairman Tim. You must be doing your job well, the job that guy gave you yesterday, right? It's a Hopi-specific question, about the settlement. And my understanding is Congress still needs to approve the settlement before it formally goes into law, So this question kind of anticipates that's going to happen. And the way the question is phrased is, Chairman Tim, what are Hopi's plans for water development following the settlement?
So we see industry happening all around us, right? It seems to be kind of cruising right past indigenous tribes. So much like our relatives, we have a vision for that to happen, but you need infrastructure in order to get to that place that we need to get to. I do want to back up and preface my answer to the question a little bit about the 40-year adjudication that we've been in. Again, I mentioned earlier that this foundation was built on the backs of others. It just put us in a fortunate spot where we learned from the lessons that were, laid before us to get to a place where we're at. So we got that across the finish line, but it took inclusion and putting some differences aside so we can all get to that place that we needed to get to. I think an important component of this also is we're not mentioning one important key tribe that's involved in this, and that's the San Juan Southern Ute tribe. It doesn't matter how big of a tribe you are or how small you are. We have communities that are also needing the accessibility to reliable water. So that whole settlement is slated to deliver water to areas that don't currently have access to that, including Hopi. So while while I'm encouraged that we got this portion done and all 3 tribes legislation passed with unanimous votes and support, we were recently in DC doing that advocacy work, and I think the message was well received. And again, I'm encouraged by the support that we're receiving from there. But in order to get to those development points, we do have to have that. We have current the Wahovi development that we're looking at for a new community, which will involve housing, which is much needed, I think, not only in Native America, but in many of our communities. Bringing that infrastructure in is definitely going to help with that. We have renewables that we're talking about and we've gotten funded for that is definitely going to help create that development. So again, it's it's not a small component, it's a big component that will add to the diversity of what we need to do to complete that infrastructure out on Hopi. It's important for us that we receive mandatory funding. I think that elephant in the room was definitely brought out, which I'm glad it was, because there's a $5 million or $5 billion price tag on this, but that includes 3 tribes. And part of the question and our response to that in DC was, well, how about, we look at kind of some earmarks. It has to be mandatory because we've talked about it before. I heard it from other tribal leaders when we're meeting with federal partners, how sometimes there's something thrown in that creates that division. And it's pitting tribes against one another. So if you're looking at it in that component, you'd be asking for us to waive our settlement agreements here and pit ourselves against one another to fight over what kind of funding allocations are out there, and that can't happen. This is a conjoined effort, and we continue to support and make sure that we're moving in the right direction in reference to that. I know it's a long way of answering that question, but we do have some development opportunities that's hinged on this pipeline. It's not going to happen overnight, but we'll definitely get it done. And I have to reference that we're at the end of this pipeline, so we have to make sure that there is accountability held all the way to make sure that it reaches all 3 tribes. And much love goes out to San Juan Southern Paiute tribe also for, making sure that their leadership was engaged in this to make sure that that delivery goes to them also. Again, doesn't matter how big of a tribe you are, doesn't matter how small of a tribe you are, we're all relatives. And for everybody else in the room, it's sustainability, it's life, and we have to provide that to everybody. So one thing I do want to add also is the impacts across Native tribes, everybody else. Some have their water rights, but delivery is not currently an option that's on the table for them. So we have to continue to be those solution-based minded individuals to try to find ways we can bring resolve, because in the bigger picture, I think if we're able to do that, it helps a broader scope. So we always have to keep thinking outside that box and not have tunnel vision, because that vision is grand, and not only for Hopi, but I see that with a lot of our tribal nations also. So I hope that answered the person's question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know there's a lot of interest in that settlement. If I may, I've gotten permission. We might go over a minute or two, but not by much. Peck, are you down to handle one more? To field one more? All right, climate change. This one's a zinger, and that's the reason I asked for permission to go over a bit. This is a question that connects Colorado River management with what you said about climate mitigation policy. And the way that the person who posed the question phrased it is, the United States is the #1 producer of oil and gas in the world, and is exporting hundreds of millions of barrels of oil annually. How can we connect this story to the Colorado River?
You know, John Fleck and I were talking a little about this at breakfast. And I can't speak for John, who's, as you all know, is from New Mexico and did a lot of reporting, really seems to understand New Mexican oil and gas better than I do. My parents were from New Mexico, so I thought I knew what it was talking about, but I didn't. The point is I'm sort of a pragmatist. What's going to happen to fossil fuels? Slowly, right now, solar, these are the big solutions for climate change. Solar, wind, including offshore wind, which is the most economic, and battery storage, for mobility, but also for grid stability. These are the big things. And there are other issues which we could talk about, like what's the role of hydrogen and things, long-haul aircraft. The point is that the big ones, solar, wind, battery storage, the deployment of those in the United States is exponential now, thanks to the Biden administration. Globally, it's also exponential, thanks to the US, Europe, and China. China's in the lead. China would like everyone to have to buy all these solutions from China, but so would we, right? So it's competition for market share. As the deployments get that, pick up the way they are picking up, the costs of all of these things go down. And so the cost now of solar, wind, and those two is for the energy that you get from them is cheaper now, on average, than coal, oil, and natural gas. Okay, and the reason oil and gas is sort of keeping up is because we keep increasing the subsidies for them. So the oil and gas industry is the biggest industry humans have ever known, the richest industry that humans have ever known. They can get, they've taken over a political party, it seems. If you watch what Donald Trump is, the conversations he's been having with the oil patch, big oil, he'll do anything for their campaign support. It's in the news, right? I'm not making that up. And the point is that right now it's hard for us to say, let's get rid of fossil fuels and pass a law to say no more oil and gas drilling. We have really big production in New Mexico, obviously your home state, Wyoming, of fossil fuels. Arizona, nothing. California's getting rid of it. Colorado has some, but not much. Utah, same thing. So, most of the basin states don't really have a big presence of fossil fuels, but you do, because you rely on fossil fuels for your transportation taxes. So every state, it's not just New Mexico relying on fossil fuels for a lot of their budget period, but it's also every state relies on that. So I think the solution that's in my community of people thinking a lot about mitigation is let's just go nuts with the renewable and clean solutions, low carbon solutions, which includes mobility. I'm really happy to, when I'm in Boulder, to see all this electric vehicles. I'm not sure about Elon Musk's truck. You know, it's a weird looking pickup. I much prefer a Ford Lightning, but then again, I'm from Michigan. They're made in Mexico, by the way. But the point is let's go nuts with these solutions. Let's continue to drive down the price of renewable solutions. I think we're figuring out how to do the transmission by replacing wires rather than having to build new transmission line, easements through, beautiful country and communities and things. Let's just go nuts with that. And what's going to then happen naturally within the next 5 to 10 years is fossil fuels is just going to start to fade away. I know that sounds really incredulous to many of you, but I hang out with a lot of scientists and interdisciplinary folks, including people who work on finance. And they really think that there's a cliff that big oil is about to hit where the value of their companies is going to plummet. And in the end, Saudi Arabia will still be there, but I'm not so sure about, American companies because their product will be too expensive relative to the other solutions. Before you even factor in the costs of the climate chaos that we avoid, before you even factor in the cost of the deaths, 7 million a year, people dying of air pollution related to fossil fuel burn. Before you even factor in all the other externalities, including, what's happened to the Colorado River. Just the cost of the energy is going to be too high if you generate with with fossil fuels. So I think that's the solution. Don't pick on New Mexico and their oil and gas production. Just start deploying more renewable energy and just start putting out more charging stations. I love the idea of doing this. It is the 21st century industry. Tribes can be at the table making money doing this as well as everyone else. In fact, Hopi and Navajo and Apache land is perfect for solar because it's cooler than down in the desert. And, I'm not telling you to do it or anything, but I'm just saying there's money.
We're doing it already.
There's money for everybody in this. And, and the last thing I'll say is, look what Putin is doing with his oil and gas money. Imagine if every country in the world is and every sovereign nation of the world is generating their own power. There'll probably be more peace too. So on that note, I'll shut up.
All right. One more thanks to the panel. All right. And thank you too, Jason. We have a break. It's a sunny day. It's not painfully hot yet, I don't think. So we have about 25 minutes. Sure.
We made it.